Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Simone and I'm Community Manager with the OED team. I'm delighted to be here with some of the people who involved in this fantastic project. And we are also honored to be joined in the audience by Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., who spearheaded the project. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jennifer Heinmiller so she can do the round of introductions and start the event. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you everyone for being here today. We are very excited to bring you this presentation. I will start with introducing myself, and then the rest of the team will be able to introduce themselves. My name is Jennifer Heinmiller. I am Executive Editor of the Oxford Dictionary of African American English. I'm also co-author of the Dictionary of Southern Appalachian English, active in linguistics, and I love everything language related. So next, I will hand it over to Dr. Tracy Weldon. Tracy, if you could give us a brief introduction.
Thanks so much, and hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Weldon. I am an advisory board member for the Oxford Dictionary. I am also currently serving as Vice President of Executive Search for Greenwood Asher. Previously spent 27 years in higher education as a sociolinguist, specializing in African American language varieties, including Gullah Geechee, which is spoken along the coast of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida. Excited for today's conversation.
Thank you, Tracy. Next, we have Bianca Jenkins, one of our lexicographers on the dictionary.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Bianca Jenkins, lexicographer on the project. I live in South Carolina, and I study linguistics at the University of South Carolina.
Thank you, Bianca. And finally, we have Anansa Bembo, our other lexicographer on the project.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anansa Benbo. I'm based in New York. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm one of the lexicographers on the project, and I'm also the host of the Black Language Podcast, and very excited to be here.
Thank you, Anansa. So now we're going to view the presentation that we've prepared ahead of time. Hello, and welcome to the March 2023 webinar for the Oxford Dictionary of African American English. Thank you for being here today and joining the team for a discussion about our journey to the first 100 words for this dictionary project. The project originally launched in June of 2022, so we are quickly coming up on a year into the project, and it will be published in spring of 2025. The project is made up of a team of lexicographers and researchers. Our lexicographers are out of Oxford Languages, headed by me, Jennifer Heinmiller. I am executive editor of this project, and we have two lexicographers, Bianca Jenkins and Anansa Bembo. We also have our research team out of Harvard University, and they are managed by Stephen Niven, as well as Grace Reynolds and Victoria Oliha. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the scope and the aim of the ODAAE. So the dictionary will illuminate the history, meaning, and significance of African American English, and it will serve as a cornerstone of new research into African American language, history, and culture. The dictionary will be based on historical principles of lexicography, which were established by OED. And we will frequently be cross-referencing OED as we're working closely with them. We will have 1,000 senses ready for publication by March of 2025. And senses includes each meaning that we have. And by that, I mean words that have a single meaning each, as well as other words that have more than one meaning. And a great example of this is the term cakewalk, for which we've identified 6 meanings. And in just a little bit, Bianca will introduce us to a couple of those. Some possible additional features that we're looking at, and product development is still in progress for these. But for the front matter of the dictionary, we will include a historical sketch of African American English speech communities and an outline of some of the grammatical features. We will also have regional usage maps where appropriate, so we can show the geographic distribution of various terms and senses. We plan to have pronunciations with multiple audio samples where appropriate. And that means that we will have speakers recording samples. The speakers will be from a variety of demographic groups, and regions, again, where appropriate. We will also include a complete bibliography with clickable links within the entries that take readers to the full bibliographic information. And that will help casual browsers as well as researchers locate more information so they can explore the topics of their choice. So now I'm going to hand it over to Anansa.
So we've received initial funding for 3 years from the Mellon Foundation and are planning to publish in spring of 2025. And the groups involved on the project are Oxford Languages, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, and our advisory board consisting of various scholars in the field. And now I will pass it on to Bianca.
Thanks, Anansa. So again, getting into our progress so far, we have inclusion principles developed and documented. We also have approximately 200 senses drafted. And again, those are the various meanings assigned to terms. We have 1,500 terms identified for consideration for inclusion. And we also have more than 2,600 quotations identified as evidence for terms. So I'll pass it to Jennifer to discuss our inclusion principles and where we are gathering all of these quotations from.
Thank you, Bianca. Okay, so inclusion principles. So the dictionary is going to include terms and senses that meet specific criteria and fulfill particular purposes. So when we're looking at which terms and senses we want to include, we take the following into account: the cultural and historical significance of the term or sense within African American culture. We're looking at a variety of regions and time periods for each term and sense. We're also looking at a range of subject domains, which we have identified. And a few of these would be religion and beliefs, sports and games, fashion, music and dance, food and drink, etc. We have quite a lengthy list of these, and this helps us just provide a well-rounded picture of African American culture and language. We're also looking at major African American English lexicographical works. For the quotations that make up the evidence for the different senses, the dictionary will acknowledge the contributions of individual African Americans in the development of the African American English lexicon and of the broader English lexicon by illustrating entries with quotations that we will pull from African American literary greats, some of these being William Wallace Brown, W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison, Martin Luther King Jr., Toni Morrison, John Edgar Wideman, and August Wilson. We're also pulling from African American artists and musicians through lyrics from jazz, blues, hip hop, and R&B. And this includes contemporary music as well as early music, the beginnings of jazz. We will also be looking at slave narratives and abolitionist writings, African American English that appears in natural context. So this is sources such as letters, diaries, newspaper and magazine articles, Black Twitter, etc. We really want to look at how the language is used in natural forms of discourse. And we will also be looking at Black scholarly commentary. So the process of the dictionary, we have the research component and then the drafting of the entries. As I mentioned earlier, this project is a collaboration with Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. So our editorial team works closely with the researchers in smaller teams to investigate the senses of terms and to search out quotation evidence and build those paragraphs. The editorial team is responsible for drafting the entries based on the research that we compile in this project. Both teams participate in various workshops and training sessions, which are given by various teams and individual editors from Oxford Languages. We have group editing sessions with editors from the Oxford English Dictionary. We also have expert input on subject matter from time to time. Finally, we're working with finalization editors from Oxford Languages to bring the entries to publication standard, which we will be doing more of as the project progresses towards publication. So now that will bring us to some of the words that we would like to present, and I will hand it over to Bianca to discuss the term cakewalk.
Thank you, Jennifer. So starting with some of our historical terms, we have cakewalk, which is a contest in which enslaved Black people would perform a partner-based stylized walk judged by an enslaver. The winner would receive some type of cake as the prize. The cakewalk in its origin was a mockery of white high society. There is debate over whether or not the enslavers knew they were being mocked. We've chosen to present 3 quotations here for this sense out of the various quotations that we've gathered. All 3 quotations are coming from Black sources. The first we have is from 1884, from a source called the Christian Recorder, which is the oldest existing periodical published by African Americans in the United States. It is actually a newspaper of the AME Church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Our 1895 quotation is interesting. It's from James Edwin Campbell, who was an African-American poet, considered one of the first African-Americans to write in an African-American vernacular dialect. Today, we would call this orthographic representation of Black language I dialect, which is the use of non-standard respelling to represent dialectal or colloquial pronunciation. And finally, we have our 1899 quotation from the Afro-American, which is a weekly African-American newspaper published in Baltimore, Maryland. While we've identified several senses of cakewalk, we will present one more today, and that is a performance that was frequently a feature of minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were a form of entertainment performed by white and Black actors, consisting of comedic sketches, often depicting African Americans as unintelligent, lazy, and happy-go-lucky. White actors, and frequently Black actors as well, would wear blackface for these performances. We are presenting this sense of cakewalk to showcase the journey that the term has taken. It began on the plantation, but soon was adapted into non-Black spaces. Our first quotation is from a non-Black newspaper, and you can see that it mentions colored people preparing for a cakewalk minstrel show. We're following that up with a 1952 quotation from Jet Magazine, which is a weekly African-American magazine published out of Chicago, Illinois, first created in 1951. And then we wrap up our quotation paragraph here with a 2009 quote from the Black Book. And we highly recommend this resource for anyone interested in Black culture or Black history. I'll pass it to Anansa for the next term.
Next, we have Busan, and adjectives that means especially of food: impressive, excellent, tasty, delicious. We're still exploring the etymology of Busan, but it likely originates from bursting and went through various phonological processes that are consistent with Geechee to arrive at Busan. And so here is our quotation paragraph for Busan. And it's worth noting that although our first quotation is from 2006 from Urban Dictionary, this term was likely well used before 2006, and that it was passed down orally as Geechee and Gullah are both oral languages, and there isn't a standard written form of Geechee. Next, we have grill, a noun that often appears in the plural as grills. And so here we have a photo of someone wearing grills, and then just a photo where you can see what a top and bottom grill can look like. And so the use of grills, it's really cool to see it move from more of a functional use to becoming a fashion statement and also a status symbol, especially within the hip hop community. Throughout the 2000s, it became common to see Black celebrities such as Nelly and Lil Jon wearing grills in various public facing events such as award shows, interviews, and music videos. And now the range of celebrities who wear grills extends past the hip hop community to include celebrities such as Issa Rae and Rihanna, in addition to Ryan Lochte sporting them while showing off his gold medal at the 2012 Olympics. And now it is also quite common to see people not of celebrity status also wearing grills.
And so here we present the definition for grill. And so we have grill as a noun, a removable or permanent dental overlay worn as a fashion statement and typically made of silver, gold, platinum, or another metal. We're still investigating the etymology, but it possibly comes from the metal grill on cars and other vehicles. And so from the grills in your mouth resembling the metal grill on cars. And as a historical note, this practice of wearing grills originates from Black people in the rural United States, as well as the Caribbean, using gold caps for dental hygiene and repair. And that practice was later made popular by hip hop artists. But it is important to note this, as wearing grills isn't new. And Black people throughout the Caribbean and rural regions of the US will wear grills due to dental care being unaffordable and inaccessible. And this can be seen on the likes of Jack Johnson, who is the first Black heavyweight boxing champion. It's also important to note that the story of Eddie Klein moving from Suriname to New York as a teen and later creating grills for rappers, and these rappers who would eventually go on to become household names in rap music and in the hip hop community. This story is important to the prominence of grills. And so Klein was inspired by the hip hop scene that he was immersed in, as well as his own experience at the dentist after receiving a gold cap on a chipped tooth. He later went to dental school and began designing grills for local rappers in New York, such as Run DMC and Flavor Flav. And then he later moved to Atlanta and began designing grills for rappers such as Ludacris and Outkast. And it's important to note that the South was a major driver in the prominence of grills. And so here is our quotation paragraph for grills, with what we've identified so far as the earliest use of grills in 1998, which is a song by Lil Troy. And then we also have a few quotations from social media, from Twitter, as well as from a novel from 2015. And now I'll pass it back to, I believe, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you, Anansa. So that concludes our presentation part of this webinar. Thank you for listening, and we'll now have some time to take some questions. So thank you for viewing the presentation. So at this point, we'll switch over to our live Q&A session. I should mention that Tracy has to leave a little bit early, so that if you have specific questions for her, please ask them as soon as possible. And before we begin this, I just want to mention again briefly that this project is supported by the Mellon Foundation and the Wagner Foundation. So we want to extend a special thanks to them. So now turning to the Q&A, we do have a number of questions that have already arrived, and we had some come in through email. So I'd like to start with one of those. This one came from Dr. Jeanette Alsop. What are the major challenges going forward in compiling the dictionary? And this is a question for all of us.
I can start. I'm sure there are will be other challenges that other folks mention, but one that I wanted to bring up is sometimes reading disturbing content is kind of a big challenge. Oftentimes we are looking at text from the 19th century. I mean, honestly, the text up until today can be disturbing still, but in particular when we're reading about Black artists who are dancers and comedians, and and just people who lived everyday lives and how they were spoken about, how we were spoken about in the 1800s into the 1900s, can sometimes be really disturbing and kind of just can sometimes ruin a good day. But then also reading about other instances of racially motivated violence against Black people, and what makes it particularly challenging is, right, we know these things exist, but when I'm looking for an example of someone using the term fish fry in the dictionary, in like a newspaper, and I'm seeing other headlines that I'm passing about race riots, police raids, and things like that, and that's kind of just reminds me that in the midst of Black people celebrating with fish fries or having fundraisers, and doing community loving things, that there's still violence happening.
I agree. That's definitely been a challenge for me as well. It can get quite heavy at times. And I think some other challenges is really just the resources that we have available. Thinking about doing research for some of our early historical terms, sometimes what we're finding are texts that are written by non-Black people and might portray Black people in a negative light. We kind of have to be wary about the representations of the speech because we want to provide, the most accurate possible quotation. Also, I think just because the research is so interesting, I feel like I'm learning so much throughout the process. It is easy to go down rabbit holes and spend a lot of time and days going, reading old newspapers and texts. And that's one of the challenges, is remembering that we kind of have a goal to get our research done and not go down rabbit holes.
I guess I'll just add to that, knowing what to include, especially in these early stages, and making sure that we are, representing the lexicon broadly. So we've spent, quite a bit of time talking through the different domains that might be included in these early representations, and just making sure that the full breadth of the AAE lexicon is represented, even though it's not exhaustive at this stage.
Yeah, I would just echo and agree with all of that, being immersed in the project myself. But I don't have much to add. Thank you for those responses. So let me go to the next question. So we have one here. Will you also examine popular language that originated from our Black queer communities? And I can start to speak to this and say, yes, absolutely, we will. And we'll be using a variety of resources. If anyone else would like to chime in with more detail.
So that's also one of the domains that we've included. So particularly, we are excited to do that research. And yeah, so yes, the answer is yes.
All right. Just looking through the questions here as more and more are coming in. Lots of interesting ones here. So let's talk a little bit about this one. How far back into history will the dictionary go when collecting citations and quotations? Colonial era, pre-colonial? And this is a great question. So the dictionary is based on historical principles, like those of the OED, if you're familiar with the way that the OED is structured. So we are looking at historical sources, but there are some unique challenges there. And I can let the other team members speak to that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that was already mentioned is that the further back in history we go, the less we can find of Black sources. So Black people having agency over how we're written about. So like that's certainly, I think, just one of the challenges with going that far back in time. And I guess important to add, though, the context of I'm not sure who is all joining, and I know the history is quite complex, but due to enslavement, Black people were prevented by law from being educated, from being taught to read, and often those who might help Black people, enslaved Black people, read or receive some sort of education would also be punished. And so Black people had to really take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves, to be safe about it, and then to eventually create our own institutions where we have the ability to produce, our own literature, writing, newspapers. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of our goals is to track the language to as early as possible. But we have run into, maybe there are different resources that just haven't been digitized. So that is another kind of challenge that we've been facing, of how to access those texts. And hopefully we will find creative ways to do so.
Okay, thank you. The next question, We have one that has quite a few votes here. Will those words that have made it outside AAVE be marked somehow as opposed to those that tend to stay within the AAVE usage? This is a really good question, and it speaks to a lot of the discussions that we've had as a team when we discuss our editorial policies and how we decide which terms are going to be in the dictionary. So of course, African American English doesn't exist in a bubble by itself, and there's a lot of overlap. And speaking as someone from the American South, a lot of the phrases that I learned in my childhood, I'm seeing those pop up in some of the things that we're looking at for quotation evidence. So yeah, it's a really good question. We are marking those in our research. Terms that seem to have very early AAE usage as opposed to terms that may have originated elsewhere. And I'd love for the team to chime in about this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, like Jennifer said, it is something that we are marking now as we do our research. I'm not sure what that might look like in the final product, but it has been eye-opening for me personally to think about so many terms and phrases that have originated in AAE and now are commonly used in more wider communities, and some that I hadn't known about before. And it's been very empowering to do the research. And I think African Americans have contributed so much to the English language. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to have ODAAE highlight that. And hopefully there will be some eye-opening moments for the readers of the dictionary in the future.
Yeah. And to add, speaking of eye-opening moments, some stuff that we've talked about before in terms of like currently with language on the internet is seeing words that we have evidence for starting in African American English, starting within the African American community, that will be labeled broadly as like language of the current generation, language of Gen Z, and things like that. And so as it was mentioned, it's something that we are marking in the research. It'll be interesting to see what it looks like in the final product. But I think that a reason why it's important to mark it is so we have, we can accurately trace the movement of these words.
Yeah. And I'll just add that I think it's one of the most important contributions of this dictionary is that it really highlights the significant contribution of the African American English community, speech community, to American English more broadly and world Englishes to some extent. It's not always easy because of the intersectionality of identities and language tied to those identities to always identify where the source lies. But I think people who read the dictionary will be surprised to see that a lot of words that have become part of our general lexicon now originated in the African American speech community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all been surprised and really delighted with seeing the trajectory of some of these terms and investigating that. The next question kind of goes along those lines. So someone asks, can you talk about the etymological research process? Being in the Caribbean, I'm particularly sensitive to seeing West Indian influence when it might be Gullah influence or shared influence from the similar founder populations. How do you go about assessing and comparing the likely candidates for etymology? Also, having dealt with Tracy in her previous position, it inspires great confidence that she is affiliated with this project. And I would completely agree with that last statement. We're honored to work with Tracy on this.
Thanks for that vote of confidence. I appreciate that. Yes, it's the same challenge to some extent, knowing exactly what the etymology of some of these words might be, but we can lean heavily on the research, linguistic research that's been done to trace at least some of those etymologies to particular West African or West Indian sources. So the same limitations apply in terms of the lack of early written sources that we can rely on. But we do have, quite a bit of linguistic research that has looked at the Caribbean influence on African American language varieties. And so we're certainly using that as a significant resource in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and just speaking more broadly, we've had a lot of conversations about etymologies recently, and that's certainly one of our biggest challenges in putting together these entries, which I'm sure Anansa and Bianca can attest to. We've had a lot of lengthy conversations about that process. Okay, so the next question. Would the dictionary consider making use of amateur word sleuths, such as those on the American Dialect Society email list, who enjoy spending their free time hunting up citations and sources for hard-to-find topics and expressions? Yes, absolutely. So if you go to our homepage, and I believe there should be a link in your registration, but we can certainly put that in the chat if not. We do have a submission form where you can put your suggestions. You can give us your information if you'd like to be involved as a volunteer a little bit later in the project. We're still coordinating all of the pieces for getting that going. But yeah, we very much want this to be a community-based project, and we welcome the voices from within the speech community, from amateur or otherwise linguists, and anyone who wants to help out. We strongly encourage you to get involved and send us that form. Okay, going back to the questions here. Assuming that the ODAAE is a general dictionary, how were the first entries selected? So this goes back to our editorial process, and I will turn this over to our two lexicographers if you'd like to describe how we've been selecting those and how we categorize them.
Sure. So we are relying and thankful for the work that linguists and other Black people have done before us in compiling other dictionaries. So we look at Clarence Major's work, Geneva Smitherman's work, and then we've come across other glossaries from the likes of Cap Calloway, Zora Neale Hurston, but also the OED also kind of jump-started us a little bit with words that they have that have been marked for African American English or for being spoken within the Black community. That's where we often start with words. But then we also have a process where we'll just by researching terms, come across other terms. So you might be looking at one dance and then you'll come across 6 more dances, and then those dances will also get added to our list to be investigated to see if they're worthy of inclusion.
Yeah, we are also taking all of these terms and categorizing them into different domains because we want to present as evenly balanced as possible representations of different factors of Black culture and Black language. So whether that be music or food or events and customs, they all get that kind of tag. And then we go through a process of prioritizing the terms based on their representation in other dictionaries and other lexicographical works before us, as well as our familiarity with the term. And we're just looking to put together the first 1,000. So yes, it's an interesting process.
It's not an easy process, though. I will add that it's not easy at all because it's, like everything feels valuable. Everything feels like it should go in the dictionary. And then one of the other things that I enjoy doing for fun, but I know that I'm not the only one on the team that does it, is watching documentaries, watching movies, watching old TV shows, old 90s sitcom reruns, and just copying things down to add to the list if it's not already on there. And so, yeah.
It's exciting because the list is always growing.
It is every day.
Always growing. And we also have that submission form. So if anyone has ideas.
Yeah. If anyone out there would like to help us grow that list, it literally does grow every day. And I think it's also fair to say that the list of domains, these different categorizations, that's growing and constantly evolving as we think we have, one semantic realm defined, and then we find some term that seems to overlap or just gives us a new perspective. So it's really allowing us to fine tune our process. Okay. All right. Next question. We have, how well do you vet sources like the Urban Dictionary, which is full of bizarre or incorrect usages and some info added by trolls? I think we have definitely run across sources with questionable veracity of material. Yeah, I'll turn this over to the team. What do you guys think?
I think because of what was mentioned in the question with trolls and sometimes, people submitting things that might be inaccurate, that it's important to take Urban Dictionary with a grain of salt. But speaking for myself personally, for the project and for work I've done in the past, I've certainly kind of just looked at Urban Dictionary to see what's said, to see what people who I hope are using the term, like to see like what they think of it in terms of how they use it, how they would describe it. But it's certainly easier to do that when I'm already familiar with the term and can kind of have an idea of like how it's used, how I use it, how people I know use it, so I can kind of suss out what is trolling information and what is, someone putting information that is accurate on an Urban Dictionary.
Yeah, we also have the ability to put a little more research into a term that maybe someone who's contributing to Urban Dictionary might not have. So really, we're looking for quotations in a lot of different areas across the longest period of time we can find to kind of support any claims that are made about what a term means and how a term is used.
All right, thank you for that. Just scrolling through these questions a little bit more. So it looks like we have one that's pretty highly voted. So the Dictionary of Canadianisms uses a 6-tiered typology offering a rationale why the term / meaning is considered Canadian, or why not? Have you considered making your rationale of what makes a term AAVE not public in such manner as well? This may not be possible in this first iteration, but we found the typology lifts the debate of inclusion / exclusion on an entirely new level. Good work, glad to see it. The dictionary is here, by the way, and then we have a link, and a 3-pager on the types is here, and then another link. First of all, thank you for the links. This is great information. We are somewhat familiar with the Dictionary of Canadianisms, but it definitely warrants further research on our part. So I want to thank you for bringing that to our attention. We are developing criteria for what is and is not considered AAE. And I think it will probably not be included in the first iteration. That's subject to change since we're still, within the first year of the project. But yeah, I think that is a really good thing for us to put out there in the future. So I thank you for bringing that to our attention. And I also encourage everyone in the audience to check out those links because it's a really great reference work. All right, so we have the next one. What is the proportion of historical / obsolete to currently used words in your current sample and the entire projected dictionary? I think there are several layers to this question. It's a really interesting question. So we have 2 different categories, historical and obsolete. And I think, thank you for being a bit merciful and using the word projected because we're still, gathering the terms and doing the research. But yeah, so in the course of our editorial work, Bianca and Anansa, what would you say as far as historical versus very contemporary terms, or otherwise terms that kind of span a really broad range of time periods?
For me, I think that's kind of hard to answer, but I know that we're doing the best job we can in balancing it. So as we work on different batches of terms, sometimes we're working on a lot of historical terms, and then the next batch will be a little more contemporary. But I think for a final product, we'll have as much of a balanced representation as we can.
Yeah, I think just to add we do, I don't know why I'm word vomiting right now. I need to laugh and then I'll feel better. But yeah, so just to add, like that, there was a point where, like in the beginning, where we were really focusing on terms that were historical or older terms. Like there's so much history there, and there's so much about the contributions to American society that is in those historical terms, and so it seemed really important to focus on those. But we do alternate between historical and contemporary, and like Bianca said, I think that once like as we continue going, we'll be able to kind of see where the gaps are maybe in certain eras, and where we have more representation than others. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think the balance will be important. It's important to show that this, this is not new. It dates back, to the earliest days, but it's also a living lexicon. And so, again, in terms of representation, we want to make sure that we're showing, the full breadth of the lexicon. The earlier terms are going to have challenges just in terms of how much has been documented, and being able to trace sources in that way. The more current terms are, they're in flux. And so the meanings could change before the dictionary comes out. And so they all bring, their challenges, but I do think it's important that we try to find that balance across time.
Thank you. Next question at the top of the list here. And this is a really good question. And Tracy, I would love for you to take this one. How much discussion has there been about the name of the variety in the title of the book? AAVE, AAE, AAL, and so forth.
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of discussion within the linguistic community, and what the language is called has changed quite a bit over time within the literature, and there's a little bit of a transition, I think, now from AAE, African American English, to AAL, African American Language, and lots of sort of debate around how those labels might get used. We have not spent a lot of time yet as an advisory board and as a full team talking about what the dictionary itself should be called. I do think it's important that we spend some time with that discussion, especially given the history of the trajectory of the term within the linguistic community. But I think if we're also paying attention to the ways in which the term is being taken up now by the broader community, I have been inspired to see the term African American Vernacular English making its way into Twitter, into just the language of everyday people. And so I think we also need to pay attention to how it's being taken up by the community and take some of our cues for what to call the final product in that regard as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. So the next one we have is, have you researched any words that have had surprising origins? Open questions. Let's put on our thinking caps here.
One of the terms for me was one that we presented in our presentation earlier, was Cakewalk. It has such a rich history, and there are so many senses that we've been able to identify. But I wasn't familiar with it at all. I kind of just to say something is a cakewalk to mean it's easy, or to say, oh, that takes the cake. I was familiar with that, but I didn't realize the origin of the term, and to know that it stems from a practice during enslavement. So that's been surprising, and again, empowering to continue to learn my history.
I can say one that has surprised me, maybe for slightly different reasons, is how unfamiliar some folks in my own network are with the term kitchen, which for me was a pretty common term growing up. I ran it by my kids. They had no idea what I was talking about. So, I'm wondering if it's something that might be, particular to Black women, and, conversation around Black hair, or if this is a term that may be not getting passed on to younger generations of speakers. And so, you know, those aha moments when you realize that a term that you think, you know, everyone shares is actually not necessarily common knowledge. Kitchen referring to the nape of the neck, by the way.
Yeah, actually, we have some other slides with example entries. I think we have a little bit of information here on kitchen. Right, yeah, just so everyone in the audience can learn a little bit more about it. And Anansa and Bianca, feel free to jump in with some of your research thoughts here. So this is the quotation paragraph, or the draft of the quotation paragraph for evidence of the term that Tracy was just referring to.
Yeah, I think so. Particularly for kitchen, what was the most surprising was the earliest piece of evidence in 1918, which is coming from the Half Century magazine, which is an African American magazine. And so I grew up saying kitchen, so I don't know if it took kids after me. But actually, I just saw a movie this past weekend. What movie was it? It was A Snowy Day in Oakland, with Kimberly Elise and Dion Cole and Loretta Devine. There was a barbershop scene, and the guy needed to clean up his kitchen. And it was just such a cute thing, because what's also fun about the dictionary is watching TV for my leisure, and just seeing things pop up, and it's like the work never stops, but it's just like, oh my gosh, should I put this for like our most recent evidence of use, yeah, so for me, it was really exciting to come across the Half Century magazine, because this was the first time I had heard of the Half Century magazine. So to now have that as a resource was really cool, and then to see it go back to 1918, which means that if it's written in 1918, it was said before that, and so that is pretty exciting. And I think an example of a word that I know Jennifer had mentioned earlier, words that kind of just span such a long period of time. And I think this is one of them.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I was just thinking of some of our other discussions. If I can go through here, so you can see a little bit of our work here. One of the terms we've recently drafted and discussed at length is old school. And this was a really interesting one. And as Anansa was saying, this is one of those terms that comes up everywhere in media and regular conversation. And it was really cool to me to see how far back this phrase goes, even outside of English, just meaning something that's traditional or old-fashioned, looking at the OED etymology. And we have it dating back to at least 1712, but then we can also see that it came into AAE to mean something very specific in a music sense, which is fascinating to us. And you can see going through these different eras of music. And I think Anansa can also speak with some expertise on this. But we also have great quotations here from a lot of experts in the field writing about this and what old school technically refers to in the musical traditions.
Yeah, this was fun. This was also like what Bianca mentioned about going down rabbit holes. Did a lot of reading, mostly to decipher what is going to distinguish old school from what comes after old school, which would be like the golden age of hip hop. But then so what was really cool about this was actually meeting with Adam Bradley. And if you see the quotation we have from 2010, he's one of the authors of the Anthology of Rap, and we used a quotation from his book to talk, to kind of figure out what is starting kind of the newer school, what's considered old school. My favorite thing about this quotation paragraph is the Run DMC quotation, because Run DMC is often they're a rap group or a hip hop group, and they're often noted for kind of the transition between the older school and the newer schools, or the new the ways that hip hop was innovating. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I also want to mention, Anansi, you mentioned Adam Bradley, and he is a member of our advisory board. So yeah, we're grateful to have his expertise. So we have this comment/question is for Bianca and Anansa. I just want to say it is so empowering to see young Black female linguists working on this project. As a fellow young Black female linguist, Seeing representation in this field is so impactful, especially when the work is so important and so personal. How has working on this project affected your own sense of identity and community?
Well, thank you for your kind words and for that question. It's very emotional for me. It's been so empowering, and it has been, it's very cheesy to say, but it's been very life-changing. And it's just been one of the best experiences I've had in a work environment. And I'm very happy to be on a team of people that are dedicated and passionate about this work. And it's been empowering. I might have already said that, but it's been empowering.
Yeah, I just got goosebumps after Jennifer finished reading the question, because it's like every day I feel like I'm learning so much new information, and it's just like, what does it do for how I think about myself, how I think about my community? It makes me so much more just intentional. It's reinforced my enjoyment of literature, of photos, of capturing evidence. And I love, oh my God, I'm blanking on the name of this Black woman who has a project. It's an Afrofuturist project. She has a line that just says, there are Black people in the future. And I'm going to find her name and just put it in the chat, because I feel really weird about not knowing her name right now. But that means so much to me, to think that there are Black people in the future. It's such a simple line, but a joke that often gets made on the internet is that sci-fi movies don't think that Black people exist in the future, because we're often like left out. I think that there's maybe more representation now. Like we had the one faction in like Hunger Games, and then there was like some Black kid, but it's not like we're really truthfully represented in our fullness in the future with what, if Black people have innovated, throughout our time here in America. Do you not think we will be doing stuff in the future to help fight off zombies and diseases? You know what I'm saying? And so for me, when I think about there are Black people in the future, it makes me think about the newspapers that we're reading from the past, the books that we're reading for the past. And I'm just like, they knew that there were Black people in the future, because I'm always wondering, like, I'll find one word, like I'll read a book. Maybe I don't know who the author of that book might be, but that book will have used the word that I need one time. And I'm like, they know what they were doing with that, and it's like they had to know that this was important. I had a professor that said writers make choices. And so I'm like, these writers were making choices. And so they had to think about us in the future. And so for me, I just feel really proud, to be honest, and excited. And we have talked about being a team of primarily women, mostly women. And then that's also really exciting too. So yeah.
I just wanted to say, you said that so eloquently, Anansa, and I definitely agree. I also just wanted to say, before I got involved in this project, I knew very little about lexicography at all. And it's been really, really cool to kind of learn about the field and to think about staying in the field and thinking about Black representation in this field. So it's just been a great experience.
I actually have to jump off, and I'm so happy I was here to witness this moment. I'll say for those of us who are a little older than young, it's also an exciting project and an exciting time to be engaged. We do. I think there was a question earlier about the full team, and we do have a multi-generational team, and I think that will strengthen our project as well, to be able to bring all of these perspectives and experiences to this project. I look forward to the next iterations and to continuing this important work with this amazing team of scholars. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. So the next one we have, what about using African American Sign Language? This is a really great question, and one that we do get from time to time. Currently, it's not within our scope. We don't have any experts really on the team at this point, but it's certainly something that we'd like to take into account further down the line. So thank you for reminding us of that, and we will definitely take that into consideration as we move forward with the project. The next question we have, Let's see. Are you attempting to trace the earliest uses of each sense as the OED does? So a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar. The Oxford English Dictionary, it's a record, tries to be a complete record of the English language, does a fantastic job of that. And each entry has a quotation paragraph where the staff do try to find the earliest written evidence for that particular sense of the word. So I'll hand it over to the team.
We are also trying to do the same, following suit with OED, and we're really thankful to the staff of the OED. We've gone through various trainings, and this dictionary is going to be based on those historical principles, so we do our best effort to find the earliest written evidence of our terms.
This is also when we go down rabbit holes. They're really fun though. But it's like you always wonder, like, okay, 1933, can I find 1932? You know? So knowing when to stop is something that I personally am still learning.
And I can say even after well over a decade in lexicography, I'm still learning how to do that too, put the reins on the rabbit hole jumping. But I also want to mention here that we do have a really close connection with OED and the staff there. And we collaborate with them every single day in our work. Which is extremely helpful in developing these editorial policies and figuring out these earliest known evidence. And we trade notes a lot too. Sometimes our evidence overlaps in terms that we're both working on as respective teams. The next question we have is, will the dictionary be available online, subscription, and in hard copy? This remains to be determined, quite honestly, but it will certainly be available digitally. OUP is focusing on digital first, so we're not quite sure what form that will take, but it will be available browser-based internet at bare minimum. So we will, of course, be sending out information once we're more certain of those developments. So yeah, definitely reach out to us to stay in the loop, and we will be posting news updates periodically. Anansa talked about offensive terms, but will offensive terms be included as a way of educating people about what is offensive? In particular, at least historically, dictionaries have not been sensitive to what is taboo. This is a really great question and point of discussion that we've talked about a bit. Yeah, and Anansa, if you'd like to start us off on this one.
Yeah, so this is the discussion we've had various times about offensive terms and about if these offensive terms are starting within the Black community or if they're terms that people are using towards the Black community, and kind of figuring out how we're going to go about that, especially if like certain terms then eventually get used by Black people. So yes, and I would also welcome any other input from Jennifer and Bianca about that. But like those are discussions we've been having. Now, as far as like terms that started within the Black community and that are offensive to other people in the Black community, what I think of immediately are, a lot of times derogatory terms for Black women and Black queer folk. Those terms will be in the dictionary, but we haven't really, I don't think that we've really talked about yet. Well, we've talked about wanting to, of course, be sensitive in how we handle it, right? But I don't actually know what that will completely look like yet. But so yeah.
Yeah, I think so far, as we've done research for terms that are considered offensive, I think our practice is to mark that clearly in the definition. And when it comes to, again, getting to, more historical terms where the first written evidence we have of the term is coming from a non-Black source and potentially written about Black people in a derogatory way, I think it is important to include those types of evidence and make it clear through some type of notation that this is the way that Black people were spoken about at this time. And as a historical dictionary, though it can be uncomfortable at times, it's really important to show the history of Black culture and of the terms in our language.
And I just want to add to that, as Bianca said, the definitions will be handled in a sensitive way and they will express such. And we're also going to have some kind of a tagging system so that readers will know immediately. They'll get a little, heads up warning that this term may be offensive to various groups of people. So if they don't wish to continue reading it, or they want to take a little time with it, then that information will be immediately available. So we're very sensitive to that. And yeah, we're not quite sure what form it will take in the final product, but that's something that we're taking very seriously. This is a good question to do with the more linguistic side. The examples in this presentation primarily involved words that belong to lexical categories like nouns and verbs. Will the dictionary also address functional categories such as determiners, prepositions, and the like? And that's, a very astute observation. And yes, I can say that we will be handling all lexical categories that we have evidence for. So yeah, we have been looking at various verb forms recently. And it really depends on what kinds of evidence we can find. What Bianca and Ansa, what do you think? What have we been doing recently with other types of words?
Well, we've been consulting our advisory board about their research in some of these terms. So I know more recently, I think we were talking about done did, or what was the other one? Stressed been, and how they, and like what they mean. And I know we've maybe talked about if there's like regional differences, because there were some things that we're not currently always familiar with. But that's actually this, I guess, lexical category is what I'm really excited in getting into. I have a feeling it might be hard to look for evidence of these terms, but I'm excited to do so.
I agree that it'll be excited to go through that research and have that represented in the dictionary. Something that I've heard a lot growing up is that African American English is just standard American English with mistakes, and that's not true. And AAE is systematic and rule governed, and it'll be worthwhile to kind of showcase the different grammatical features of AAE in the dictionary.
Yeah, I think you put that so well. And I think it will be very important to really show that it is rule governed. And to that point, we will also be including a collection of essays and some information like supplementary to the body of the dictionary, kind of outlining some of those grammatical features in a more like essay type format that goes into a deeper explanation. And then people will be able to look up the individual words, the verbs or prepositions or other function words that you mentioned for more examples, and to be able to trace those through time with the quotation paragraphs that we're able to assemble. Who is the target user of the dictionary? How has that affected the drafting of definitions?
So I know we've talked about users of our definitions potentially being students, potentially being scholars, researchers, and then also everyday people like myself. And something that we're working through right now is a kind of voice or style that we want in our definition entries, to really make sure that it is accessible, it's written in an approachable manner, and is honestly easy to read and understand.
Yeah, I'll just add that I agree. And I hope that anyone who might come across the dictionary would be able to find it accessible.
Yep. Yeah. And I agree with that as well. And we're crafting the definitions with that in mind, certainly, and getting a lot of great input from editors with the OED, how they would make things really approachable for people from all walks of life as well. Okay, next question. This is an interesting one. Now that you've had some time to set up these processes and data sets, what are the resources, sources of data, or types of support that you are currently wishing for access to, either in terms of making the project more robust / representative, or in terms of making your task as researchers more manageable? Well, what immediately springs to mind for me, and this will sound a little flippant, but a time machine would be wonderful. Yeah, I often find myself wishing that we could just, find these the evidence of these terms that we know go back further, much further than what we have written evidence for, but it's just simply not there due to the limited body of evidence. Due to either undereducation in as far as literacy goes, 200-300 years ago of these populations, or just because paper doesn't last very long and we've lost things just due to time passing. But aside from that, we do have a great set of databases that we use, and language corpora. We're exploring a lot of that right now. I would say, really, if there are any other language corpora or huge collections that would be easy to navigate, or maybe some kind of historical collections that we're not aware of, that would be really useful for the team. And we're trying to go through these as best we can. And there's so much out there. But I would just say, along those lines, if anyone has ideas who is listening or watching this, to definitely drop links in the chat for us if you have access or want to clue us into something that we may not be currently aware of.
I think for me, we are collaborating with our research team from Harvard, and they have a great list of databases for us to use. And some of those databases are not, we can't always, search through for terms, and some of those are like abolitionist letters and things like that. And so it would be really cool to be able to, have an easier advanced search. I'm also for myself advocating on Twitter for Genius, which is Rap Genius, but they changed their name to Genius, to add an advanced search option to their website, because we've used lyrics.com, but sometimes the data on there definitely needs to be double checked. Rap Genius, from my experience, tends to be like more accurate with their data, but it's so much harder to search because you can't limit by decade, by genre, by like lyrics exactly like this, or just, search for these terms in any kind of way in this. But lyrics.com has that. And so I would love if lyrics.com and Rap Genius just got together and fixed the advanced search. But then also, I really like using, Coral, so the corpus of regional African American language. And so I'm really looking forward to that continuing to expand so that we can use it more.
I don't have much to add there, but I definitely agree. It would be great.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Is there any kind of end date for publication? I know 100 words have been cataloged, but with the richness of the vernacular and how fast things change, how will you determine when it's ready to publish? And yeah, Tracy alluded to this earlier. The language changes so quickly, as with any language variety. Things can pop up and go out of date so quickly, even, from the time that we think we have our senses and definitions finalized, that brief window before publication, things can change radically. So right now we actually have, although the theme of this webinar is, of course, the first 100 words, we have identified more than 1,500 senses of words to consider for inclusion. So we're currently researching those and beginning to draft those. But as far as like an end date, we would like this to be a living project, much in the same way OED is. So it will have initial publication of the first 1,000 senses, excuse me, in spring 2025. But we do want to be able to extend it beyond that initial period so that we can do these appropriate revisions, because as you so rightly point out, things will change very rapidly. And we want to be able to inventory all of the senses possible where there is evidence. Next one, we touched on this a little bit in a previous question. But maybe our lexicographers could speak a little more to this with some of the research that they've been doing. What about items which overlap with Southern White English?
So for the research that that I've done, I've seen this come up with some of our food terms where we'll have food that is typical of African American cuisine that will also be cooked by white people in the South as well. For those terms in particular, though, we've been able to identify like who were originally cooking, like these types of food, things like maybe peach cobbler, banana pudding, fried catfish, chitlins, and although the food now is eaten by wider populations, especially throughout the South, we've been able to identify that the origins are from the African American community.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to part of the conversation that we were having earlier, that there have been so many contributions to the English language from African Americans. So again, we're taking notes of that on the back end as we do our research. I'm not sure how it will be represented in the final product, but there are certainly a wealth of terms that are now used in wider communities.
All right. Next question we have. This is a good one. Rabbit hole temptation would plague anyone persistently curious enough to take on this great work. Well said. Can you relate any experiences you had hunting down a usage that might have seemed elusive but resulted in a find so important or fascinating you felt like you brought to light a meaning or story that will serve our understanding in the years to come? All right, what kind of anecdotes can we share here?
Okay.
I feel like nearly every term we have this to some degree or another. What are some you guys would like to share?
Yes, I want to talk about do-rag, which is the word I've talked about before in the past
Good choice.
many of times, but I just think it's so important. So originally I was given the word do-rag, which is now I forgot the definition, but it's just kind of like the way that you would like wrap your hair to protect it, especially like while you would sleep. So originally it comes from like a hairdo rag, so it was a rag that covered your do. But around the 60s, what I was seeing was use of do-rag that seemed more like an adjective, and that was really interesting to me. What I eventually learned was that calling youth do-rag teenagers or do-rag boys was how older people would talk about youth who were particularly rebellious, especially throughout the civil rights movement, who at protests and demonstrations might be the ones seen doing, maybe looting or being, more willing to be arrested or kind of just seen as kind of being like more rebellious. And so the other thing, though, is at that time, the do-rag was used specifically to protect the conch, which is also a word that we have that Bianca worked on. And so these boys were like young, they had like the latest hairstyle, and so yeah, so they had the latest hairstyle. They're seen as rebellious. They're not listening to authority. It really reminded me of how we think about youth today, and especially given the year that we had in 2020. But really, since I think Black Lives Matter really popped off after the killing of Trayvon Martin. So for about the last 10 years or so, we've seen youth in protests being talked about in a specific way. And from my opinion, it seems that youth are often dismissed, that their opinions are not heard, but also that we don't have as many spaces to engage with youth about what they're thinking about these policy changes that are affecting their life, or how they feel like they might be overlooked, or the harassment that they may face from police and in their community. And so the reason why I think that now, knowing that these youth might have been kind of just dismissed as do-rag teenagers, I'm hoping that as we move towards the future, that we engage with youth in a more intentional way around civic issues, around social justice issues, because as a former educator, they have a lot of opinions and they know what is happening in the world.
Yeah, and it's funny also that you mentioned conch, because I kind of just in a more general addition to this conversation, so much of the research that we do is constantly evolving and new terms and senses are being pulled up. So we can start with one term, for example, which is conch, which is a chemical process that you could do to your hair to straighten it. When you're researching conch, then you find the word process, and then you find the word relaxer, and it keeps growing, and we keep adding more and more to our list. So it's always growing.
The next one I would like, especially Bianca to chime in on, because I think you have some special expertise here. Will digital discourse and terms be included? And my mind immediately goes to your work on Black Twitter. If you could speak a little bit to that, and of course Anansa as well, because we're all using these different resources.
Yeah, I think we're very excited to use social media and Black Twitter in particular in our quotation paragraphs. The work I did for my master's thesis, I basically reviewed features in fake Black Twitter accounts, linguistic features, and made the argument that the Black community realized these accounts were fake because of the language use and the lack of understanding that African American English is systematic and rule governed. This was back in 2016. There was actually a website with instructions from self-proclaimed white supremacists, basically saying, we're going to make these fake accounts. This is how we're going to do it. And this is how you're going to talk like Black people, and you're going to fool everybody. But it didn't work. And there was a response on Twitter, and the hashtag Black Twitter block was created to kind of report these accounts to Black Twitter users. But regardless of all of that, we are excited about using Twitter, and it's interesting because it's in real time. It's constantly being updated. So it's been a very useful source, especially for our contemporary terms.
All right. So I have another one that goes back to some of the older terms. Well, perhaps. How do you decide that this word is AAVE to begin with rather than of some other origin? So this really gets to the heart of some of the research that we've been doing and some of the resources that we use. Well, how do we go about that? I think it might vary by term. What are some of the strategies that you two have been using in your work?
So I think, so depending on what the term is, there are certain terms that I think this becomes easier with. And those terms are things that have been studied later on by academics. So a lot of music terms, food terms, dances, types of hairstyles, things like that have been really worked on. Using their research to kind of just read about what it is, about the origin of it, kind of helps to get to, if it's originating in AAE. But so yeah, so I think that's the answer I have now, but I think I might have to think on that a little bit more.
Yeah, we're also citing pre-existing works on Black dictionaries and Black glossaries. So if the term appears in one of those works, whether it be Jubita Jive by Clarence Major, Black Talk by Geneva Smitherman, the Zora Neale Hurston glossary, and so many others, that would be a good indicator that we can trust that it's a term starting in AAVE. But we're also, again, gathering quotations from as many sources as we can. And if we can find the term in a lot of Black sources, I think that also helps support the claim that it's a term from African American English.
And then I think, so although we would like to, obviously, to have more resources from, late 19th century, early 20th century, when we are able to trace like an original usage back to a really early African American source, that also is extremely helpful as well. And then also sometimes checking with what the OED has. And so if this is something that would be in other dictionaries, so how is it appearing in OED? How is it appearing in Green's Dictionary of Slang? How is it appearing in DARE, the Dictionary of Regional English? Also helps to kind of determine where the word first originated.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, especially if some of those great lexicographical works have a note where it may say African American or Black usage. Or sometimes what we'll do is when we find evidence in one of those works that predates what we have, we'll do a little bit of research into that particular source or author or speaker and see what we can ascertain about their background, which getting back to the rabbit holes, sometimes that leads us to even earlier works, and it's a process. It's very interesting to investigate. All right, another question. I have done extensive research on Black language that has crossed over into mainstream newspapers. Would it be acceptable for the project? Dissertation, conference presentation, essays, etc. I may be reading this incorrectly, but I'm thinking that what you're describing here is terms that originated in AAE, but that are now part of broader standard American English, so-called. And I think there are a lot of examples like this. We've certainly run across some. The first one that comes to my mind is the word cool, which is ubiquitous, you know, among Americans of pretty much every generation these days. Yeah, just thinking about some other ones. If you two have other examples you'd like to mention.
I'm actually searching for the question just to reread it. I don't know if you remembered to restate it.
I think it has moved
to the answered. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Simone.
Would it be acceptable for the project? Okay, so like words that have crossed over into mainstream. I'm wondering if the person is asking if the work would be acceptable for the project or the terms. That's why I'm having trouble figuring it out. But for, I guess, another example of terms that started and then kind of crossed over, one that was really surprising for me was hipster, which we haven't really done a deep dive into as of yet, but a hipster emerging around the jazz age to describe someone who was hip. They were knowledgeable, they were in the know about what was going on. And then over time, we now have what we think of as a hipster, which often gets kind of associated with like youth, counterculture, but isn't necessarily like tied to the original use as someone who is Black, who is also just now I want to use cool to describe a hipster, but who is a cool person around the jazz age.
Also, I'll just comment that that research sounds very, very interesting. So yeah, I would be interested to read more about it if you'd be willing to share. So thank you for letting us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're always interested in hearing about exciting new projects in the field. So yeah, we welcome you to reach out to us if you have particular projects in mind. Okay, going back to the questions here, let's see. We have, how intergenerational is your research team? Tracy touched on this a little bit, but we do have several generations represented among the team, spanning the editorial team, to our researchers who are with Harvard, to our advisory board. And first of all, I don't know specific ages of everyone on the advisory board, and I don't want to, impart information that maybe people don't want others to know, but I can say it spans a pretty broad range, which is so helpful. It really gives us a great foundation for the project, and it helps us learn and document just all of these different uses. Another thing Tracy was saying is how something that was common to her when she was younger maybe isn't now. And I think occasionally we can see these generational divides, which is really interesting. So we're very grateful to have such a wealth of a range of generations and ages involved in the project. Will you include the genre of words, formal/informal, alongside with the entries? So it looks like this is a question about how we will indicate usage or register when we draft these entries. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how we're taking that into account.
That is a good question. It makes me think about how we distinguish between like what can be considered African American English and what can be considered like African American vernacular English, kind of like the more casual register that gets used. So yeah.
Honestly, I would think it's something that I haven't thought about personally a lot. So I appreciate the mention of it, and it's something that I think we can think about now moving forward. So much of what our final product is going to look like is still in progress. So we're unsure of that. But if it's something that we can note. Maybe we'll look into it. Yeah.
It's actually, I like the question because I think for so long African American English has been thought of as, like you mentioned, Bianca, being like broken or just like English with mistakes, right? And so it's kind of it's always seen as less formal or as like not appropriate just because it's always seen as, casual, informal. But thinking about spaces, like thinking about church spaces, right? And thinking about people like Congresswoman Maxine Waters, right, who use AAE, but I'm not sure that people would consider that Black people would consider those like informal spaces. And so whereas like perhaps people who are just unaware might think that all AAE is informal, but that there are certainly ways that that there's like levels to this. But there are different registers within African American English, and that's not something that I've thought about, but could be cool to potentially point out what's maybe from a more informal register, and yeah, or like a more casual register, yeah.
Yeah, and we're definitely making usage notes when we go through and we begin drafting our entries. People might be surprised at the research that goes into each term and how many different data points we have for each quotation that we research. And that's definitely one of the things that we try to identify. And as Bianca and Anansa said, we're not sure what form that will take quite yet in the final product, but yeah, it's certainly something we will be exploring. So we are a couple of minutes over time, but thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. It's been a real pleasure to speak with everyone. And again, we welcome you to reach out to us via the form on the website. And we look forward to doing another one of these events in the future. So thank you on behalf of the entire team. And I will hand it back over to Simone.
Thank you. And just to say a big thank you to you and everybody else involved in this brilliant project. This was an absolutely fascinating 1 hour and a half, and I feel we could just go on for many hours, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. So a huge thank you for taking the time to present to us and for lending your expertise to this project. I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Apologies to the ones who posted questions and we were not able to address because we were flooded with lots of very good questions. But yeah, thank you anyway. So thanks again. And I hope everybody has a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, depending on where you are. So goodbye, everyone.
Bye.